In September of 1988, I was 10 years old, and I was just starting the fourth grade. And at that time, I attended an evangelical Christian school on the southwest side of Houston. And that year, as school was starting, there was a great deal of buzz around campus among both the teachers and the students about a new book that had just come out earlier that year. And the name of the book was 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Happen in 1988. And that book was written by a man named Edgar Whisenant. And just out of curiosity, do any of you in here remember that book? 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Happen in September of 1988. Well, it sold 4.5 million copies that year. So chances are somebody in our church owned that book. And the reason that it was so popular was because Mr. Whisenant, the author of the book, he was a NASA engineer. And so he had a reputation for being very intelligent, for being very good with numbers. He was just the kind of guy who you might expect would be able to take a look at all of the biblical prophecy and all of the numbers that went along with those prophecies and kind of put all of the pieces together. Now, since I was at an evangelical school, teachers would talk freely about things like the second coming of Jesus with students. And I can remember from our teachers this sense of caution when talking about the book, the sense of being cautious about, do we really want to place that much weight on a really specific prediction like this, while on the other hand being very intrigued. And so on the one hand they would say, well, nobody knows the day or the hour of Christ's return. But on the other hand, let's take a look at what Mr. Whisenant has to say. So here are a couple of the things that Mr. Whisenant had to say. He said, "Only if the Bible is wrong am I wrong about this. Only if the Bible is wrong am I wrong about this." And then he said, "If I could gamble with my life, I would stake my life on Jesus' return in 1988. If I could gamble with my life, I would stake my life on Jesus' return in 1988. Now, this may come as a shock to you, but Mr. Whisenant was, in fact, wrong. Jesus did not return in 1988. But that did not stop Mr. Whisenant from publishing a book the very next year, 89 Reasons Why Jesus Will Return in 1989. I kid you not, he really did release that book the very next year. Now, we laugh at this because it is absurd, right? It is absurd to think that any person could know the day or the hour of Christ's return. And in Mr. Whisenant's book, he did get specific enough as to say, well, I think it's going to come within this 2-day period, probably about this time of day. And, he was wrong about that. And yet, this is similar to how many people within the church today still approach apocalyptic passages in the Scriptures. It's how many people in the church today approach Jesus' apocalyptic teaching in today's passage of Scripture, which is Mark 13, trying to somehow match up an end-time prophecy with a current event. Just as we're going along, we're going to be in Mark chapter 13 today. We're going to bounce around a little bit in that chapter. So if you have your Bibles and you would like to follow along, go ahead and turn to Mark chapter 13. This idea of trying to match up an end-time prophecy with a current event, that's not what Jesus had in mind when he told his disciples to be watchful and to be alert. Because whatever apocalyptic saying that you think that you have lined up with whatever current event, just know that 1,000 people before you have lined up that apocalyptic saying with 1,000 different current events. And so far, they've all been wrong. And so what did Jesus mean in speaking about his return when he told us to be watchful and to be alert? Well, that's the question we're going to try to answer today. For the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about the final days of Jesus before the crucifixion, using the Gospel of Mark as our guide. And we started in Mark 11, and today we're going to be in Mark chapter 13. So when you read Mark 13, you see that it is almost entirely composed of Jesus' apocalyptic teachings directed to his disciples. Mark 13 takes place during the final week of Jesus' life before the crucifixion. And so the fact that he takes time out of this most important of weeks to devote this kind of teaching to his disciples, it says something about how important it was for his disciples to get this. Now, most of what Jesus warns his disciples about in this chapter, it actually happens in their lifetime. And so he wants them to be prepared. He wants them to be prepared for these events that are going to start happening almost immediately after his resurrection. Now, unfortunately, we don't have time this morning to go through each one of these prophecies one by one, but we will take a look at one or two of them. And before we do that, I want to direct your attention to something that Jesus says at the very beginning of Mark 13. Look at verses 1 and 2. It says, "As he was going out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, 'Look, what massive stones! What impressive buildings!' And Jesus said to him, 'Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left on another. All will be thrown down.'" In other words, Jesus is saying, that building is not as important as you think it is. Now, remember from Pastor Zach's sermon a few weeks ago, the very first thing that Jesus does when he enters Jerusalem is he goes to where? He goes to the temple, right? And then the very next day, he goes back to the temple, and that's when he kicks out the money changers. And then after that, some Pharisees approach Jesus while he is in the temple, and they challenge Jesus' authority. Now, do you think that maybe there is something important that Jesus wants us to understand about the temple? Yes, there is definitely something important that Jesus wants us to understand about the temple. And so as we take a look at Jesus' apocalyptic teaching in Mark 13, let's take a closer look at the specific teaching that he offers about the temple. And we'll find this in verses 14 through 20, where he says, "When you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, let the reader understand. Then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. A man on the housetop must not come down or go in to get anything out of his house. And a man in the field must not go back to get his coat. Woe to pregnant women and nursing mothers in those days. And pray it won't happen in winter, for those will be days of tribulation, the kind that hasn't been from the beginning of creation until now and never will be again. If the Lord had not cut those days short, no one would be saved. But he cut those days short for the sake of the elect whom he chose." I mean, there is some rough stuff in there. There really is. When you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, let the reader understand. Well, reader, how about we try to understand a little bit of what's going on here? How about we try to understand what Jesus is saying about the abomination of desolation? Well, the abomination of desolation is a phrase found in the book of Daniel. And it's referring to an event that occurs about 200 years before the time of Jesus. Now, at that time, Jerusalem was under the control of a Greek king named Antiochus IV. And Antiochus decided that he didn't want the Jews to worship their God in the temple anymore. He wanted them to worship him. And so what Antiochus did was he had God's altar removed from the temple and replaced with a pagan altar dedicated to himself. This was the original abomination of desolation. And it's actually what sparked the revolt that was led by Judas Maccabeus. Now, are any of you familiar with the name Judas Maccabeus? Right? Okay, so Judas Maccabeus, after this original abomination of desolation, Judas Maccabeus led a revolt that miraculously restored the city of Jerusalem to God's people in a great victory that they won over the Greek king. And this is actually the victory that Judas Maccabeus and his revolt won after this. That Jewish people celebrate that victory to this day at Hanukkah. So if you're ever wondering what Hanukkah was all about, it's about that victory that was won that restored Jerusalem to God's people. And so here in Mark 13, Jesus is telling his disciples that something like the abomination of desolation is going to happen again. And it did. It happened within their lifetimes. You see, in 41 AD, the Roman Emperor Caligula ordered that God's altar be removed from the temple and replaced with an image of himself. Right? Does that sound familiar? Now, this order was never carried out, primarily because Caligula died before it could happen. But the anger that this order stirred in the hearts of the people was so great that it started a series of events which eventually led to another revolt. A revolt that many Jews hoped would lead to the same kind of results that Judas Maccabeus got. But that is not what happened. This revolt led to the total destruction, not only of the temple, but of Jerusalem, the entire city of Jerusalem in 70 AD was laid to waste. Total desolation. And so in verses 14 and 15, Jesus is essentially saying, when you see the abomination of desolation, I know it's going to make you angry. I know it's going to make you want to fight. But what you need to do is run. Run to the mountains, because that building is not as important as you think it is. In Mark chapter 14, just a few days after Jesus is teaching this to his disciples, Jesus says that the temple will be destroyed and that it will be rebuilt again in 3 days. Now, what is he talking about there? That's right, he's talking about himself. He's talking about his own crucifixion and resurrection. So the reason that that building doesn't matter as much as the disciples think it does is because Jesus is saying, that's not the true temple anymore. I am the true temple. When Jesus is crucified and when he raises again from the dead, one of the things that happens is that the temple veil is torn in two at his crucifixion. The temple veil, now this is what separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple. And the Holy of Holies is where the presence of God dwelled. So when that veil was torn in two, what we are meant to understand was that the presence of God was no longer contained within that space. The true presence of God was now to be found in the person of Jesus. So when Jesus died and rose again, all of God's promises to his people, promises that up until that point had revolved around land, promises that had revolved around temple, all of those promises were transferred onto the person of Jesus Christ. Jesus is the new promised land. Jesus is the new temple. And if you want to think about something that is mind-blowing, when you or I place our faith in Jesus, God's presence, that presence that at one point was supposed to be just in the Holy of Holies, God's presence enters us, and we become part of the temple. Now, there are a number of Christian groups who are still waiting for Solomon's temple to be rebuilt. And some of them have spent millions and millions of dollars storing up supplies, waiting for the day that construction can begin, thinking that by rebuilding the temple, this will somehow trigger Jesus' return. And I want to say to them, that building is not as important as you think it is. The true temple has already been rebuilt. It was rebuilt 3 days after it was torn down. And so how about we devote our time and our energy, our worship and our prayers and our service to the true temple? This is what being watchful and alert is all about. Devoting yourself more fully to Jesus, because everything else will pass away. This past week, Pastor Tim Keller wrote an article that was published in the Atlantic magazine, talking about his own approach to life after his cancer diagnosis. And for Tim Keller, he may very well be approaching the end of his life. And in this article, he writes about how initially, when he got the diagnosis, he responded in the way that most people do when they get news like this. There was a lot of fear. There was a lot of denial. There was some doubt mixed in there. But as time has gone on since his diagnosis, Tim Keller has been getting his affairs in order. And he's been getting his affairs in order in a way that I think is the most Christian way possible. He's been getting his affairs in order by reordering his life in the way that it should have been ordered all along, by leaning more into Jesus and leaning less into himself. And he says that since he has been more intentional about doing that, every aspect of his life has become more rich. He says that his time with his wife has been more rich. He says his time in worship has been more rich. And he says that he hasn't really even stopped grieving about what may be the end of his life. But he says that even that grief is more rich because it is full of God's presence. And so as Tim Keller has changed the way in which he orders his life, you could say that he has become more watchful, more alert. You could even say that he has become more alive. And I think that's what Jesus is getting at when he's communicating this to his disciples in Mark 13. Don't fumble your way through this life without any kind of intentionality or purpose, because whether we're talking about the end of life or the end of days, no one knows the day or the hour. No one knows the day or the hour. So get your affairs in order right now so that you can live out the rest of your life in the way that you should have been living it from the beginning, by leaning less into yourself and leaning more into Jesus, more watchful, more alert, more alive. When the temple fell in 70 AD, the people in Jerusalem, both Jews and Christians, thought that it was the end of the world. And in a way it was. The world as they knew it was gone. And the question for them was, how now shall we live? The world as we knew it is gone. How now shall we live? Now, there are a lot of people who look around at the condition of our world today and they think, surely this is the end of the world. And in a way, they're right. This world is changing. It is changing technologically at a rapid pace. The moral codes of this world are changing, and they are changing at a pace that has never happened before in history. It is clear that the world that a lot of us grew up in is gone. It's no longer here. This is a different world. Now, is this the very end of days? I mean, I don't think so, but nobody knows the day or the hour. I think that we do know that the church in America and in the Western world in general, we're at the end of an era. And so right now, in a way, we're faced with the exact same question as the people in Jerusalem faced in 70 AD when their world ended. How now shall we live? How now shall we live? And the answer to that question is exactly like we should have been living all along. Leaning less into ourselves and more into Jesus, more watchful, more alert, more alive. Now, you may remember that for the last 2 Sundays, Pastor Zach talked about the fig tree that Jesus cursed outside of Jerusalem. Well, towards the end of Mark 13, the fig tree makes another appearance, where Jesus says, "Learn this from the fig tree. As soon as its branch becomes tender and sprouts leaves, you know that summer is near." In other words, when God's people, who appeared to be dead from a curse, spring up in new life, that's when the end is near. When we think about the end of days, let's not waste our time trying to match up this or that current event with this or that prophecy, because that's not being watchful. That's being distracted. Instead, let's get serious about doing the work that we should have been doing all along. Now, we've talked a lot this year about what a trying season it has been in the life of Lazy Brook Baptist Church. And we are still going through some trying things. But isn't it beginning to feel like we're starting to turn a corner here? Isn't it beginning to feel like there are some new things on the horizon? At least it's starting to feel like that for me. As the pandemic is drawing near an end, as we start to move forward with our plans for the church and even with our plans for the sanctuary and for this building, we're going to be getting excited about some of those things. Our sanctuary will one day be finished, and it's going to be awesome when we get into there. Not only that, but in a few short weeks, this space that we are currently worshiping in is going to be transformed, and it's going to be amazing. And the temptation is going to be to kind of place our hope in all of our neat new stuff. And I hope we don't do that. I hope that we have learned our lesson this season, that the building is not as important as we think it is. And so let us instead spend the rest of our time during this season focusing our attention on the true temple, Jesus Christ, and ordering our lives around Him, leaning into Him, and becoming more watchful, more alert, and more alive. Now, if anything in this message or in this worship service today has spoken to you, first of all, I want to encourage you to come and talk to me or to come and talk to Pastor Zach. We would love to pray with you. But whether that is if it's spoken to you in a way that has inspired you to maybe seek Jesus for the first time, if it has spoken to you in a way that makes you want to seek out what it means to be a member of a local church, come and talk to us. Or if you need to leave, or if you're watching from home, I want to encourage you to text "Made My Decision" to 97000. That's "Made My Decision" to 97000, and we'll get in contact with you. We'll speak with you. We'll pray with you. We'd really like to do that.